Adelante.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Maria Calderon, Senior Program Associate for the Mexico Program at the Inter-American Dialogue, and I am delighted to moderate today's conversation after the vote, What's Next for Mexico's Judiciary? This discussion comes at a pivotal time. On June 1st, Mexico held its first ever federal judicial elections, filling all 9 seats of a newly restructured Supreme Court, electing members of the Judicial Discipline Court and selecting hundreds of other federal judicial posts. The next electoral cycle, scheduled for 2027, will extend the process to remaining judicial positions. These reforms could have far-reaching implications, not just for Mexico's rule of law and democratic governance, but also for economic integration, investment, and security cooperation with the United States. We're joined by 3 distinguished panelists today. Carlota Ramos, Deputy Division Head in the Office of the President of Mexico, works closely on policy and political priorities at the highest level of government and has been directly involved in the dynamics shaping these judicial reforms. Pedro Salazar, researcher at the Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, one of Mexico's leading constitutional scholars and an expert on democratic governance, constitutional reform, and the separation of powers. And finally, Adriana Garcia, expert advisor at the Rule of Law Lab at NYU Law, specializing in judicial independence, governance, and institutional strengthening, with a focus on how reforms affect legal certainty and democratic safeguards. I'll begin by inviting each of our 4 panelists to share their opening perspectives. After that, we'll move into a moderated discussions exploring the political context, institutional design, and the implications for U.S. Mexico relations. With that, Carlota, I will give the floor to you for your opening remarks. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to the Inter-American Dialogue for creating a space to approach this debate with nuance and responsibility. I'm excited to share it with Adriana and Pedro. I'm sure it will be a very enriching conversation. As someone who serves within the federal government and has closely followed the institutional transformation of Mexico's justice system, I'd like to begin with a clear position. We are facing a moment of institutional uncertainty, but not of institutional collapse. The temptation to jump to apocalyptic conclusions is understandable, but in this point, it serves no one, and certainly not those of us committed to the rule of law on both sides of the border. It's important to acknowledge that this judicial reform is controversial, has been very controversial, and that it introduced real and profound shifts. It raises valid concerns about independence, capacity, and institutional design. But we do ourselves a disservice if we assume that change automatically equals decay. In fact, this is precisely the moment when all actors, civil society, international partners, and the judiciary itself must lean into institutional vigilance, not defeatism. Yes, this reform has disrupted a system that was in urgent need of transformation. But to assume that this disruption automatically leads to collapse, it's not analysis, it's alarmism. And alarmism in this moment doesn't help Mexico, doesn't help the business community, and it certainly does not help the U.S. Mexico relationship. From the inside, I witnessed the limits of the previous system: opacity, co-optation, and a disconnect between the judiciary and the citizenry. This reform does not erase those risks, but it does bring them into the open. Whether this becomes a democratic opening or an institutional failure depends not on the reform alone, but on how institutions, voters, and the international community respond from here forward. We need a more rigorous reading of what's happening. Here's my take. First, the structure of binding precedent remains intact. This is the backbone of legal certainty, and it has not been touched. That means that every contract, every regulatory framework, and every constitutional protection adjudicated by the Supreme Court continues to be enforceable across jurisdictions. Second, this election, unprecedented as it was, gave citizens a voice in choosing judicial actors. That voice now translates into a new kind of democratic responsibility. If we voted them in, we can demand transparency, integrity, and consequences. And third, while there are reasons to be cautious, there are also tools to be used and pressure to be applied. New institutions like the Judicial Discipline Tribunal now exist. New public expectations have been set. The challenge is not whether the system will collapse, it's whether we will step up to shape it, monitor it, and to hold it to account. So I hope to use my interventions today not to defend the reform, but to focus on the opportunities that still exist within the legal framework to strengthen judicial integrity, economic certainty, and binational cooperation without minimizing the risks ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlota, for your opening remarks. Adriana, if you could deliver your opening remarks, thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, the Inter-American Dialogue, for the invitation. I want to start my opening remarks by giving context for our discussion. The judicial reform in Mexico cannot be understood alone, right? This is part of a larger political and institutional moment marked by sustained friction between the executive branch and the judiciary, right? And by other reforms that weakened the checks and balances that we used to have in Mexico. So first, I want to talk about the origin of the reform. Over the last years, we saw repeated conflicts after courts issued decisions against important public policy proposals of the executive. At the same time, the previous president, used his morning conferences to criticize judges for the content of the rulings and suggest corruption, right? This created a hostile public narrative about the judiciary. The president also was very clear and very explicit in saying that because the Supreme Court was stopping several projects, he would pursue a plan C, which is obtain the supermajority in Congress, dismiss judges, and make all judges elected. So this is the context, right? This is happening with these circumstances. Second, I want to talk about the other amendments. So together with the judicial changes, Congress approved measures to eliminate independent agencies that have been internationally recognized, including the INAI, the body in charge of transparency and personal data protection, and the Antitrust Authority, among others. There is also a new rule that prohibits the judiciary from analyzing constitutional amendments. Seen together, these moves reduce independent oversight across branches, right? So no checks and balances. And third, the substance of the reform itself, right? What's this reform? This reform introduces direct popular election of judges, but it eliminates the judicial career service and appointments based on exams and merits. It creates a disciplinary tribunal, which members are also going to be voted. It reduces tenure, it reduces salaries, and most dramatically, dismisses 7,000 judges with the plan to elect almost every judge at the federal and at the state level, with very few exceptions. So Mexico is today the only country in the world attempting a mass dismissal of judges and the election of the whole judiciary at this scale. And I want to be fair, this reform speaks to a real demand for accountability, right? And for better service in courts, that's totally true. But accountability cannot come at the price of independence. Elections do not guarantee impartial judges, right? Right now, the combination we see targets the very features that make judges independent. And I want to finish my opening remarks with two quotes from the Organization of the American States Electoral Observation Mission. They issued a preliminary report, and this is the first quote. There are no guarantees that those elected have the technical qualifications, suitability, and specific capacities required for the roles. So far from applauding the initiative, the mission warned that this model, and I quote again, ends up weakening the transparency, impartiality, effectiveness, and independence of the judiciary. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Pedro, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Nice to be with you. Hello to Carlota and to Adriana. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. Thank you for the invitation. As Carlota has said, we are living in a moment of a great institutional uncertainty in Mexico. It's not easy to know what is going to happen with the reform that was approved, in particular this reform, judiciary reform. I must say that I have been critical of the judicial reform from the beginning, and I am still, I believe that it was a very bad idea. Mexico needed, indeed, the strength of the judicial branches. That was obvious for everyone, but it should begin, and I think that it's important to say that from the federal entities. Our biggest problem is at the level of the states in Mexico, the federal states. That is the place in which historical shortcomings were and still are enormous. The federal judiciary, on the other hand, had been functionally adequated, and I think that in a good way. In fact, the Supreme Court of Mexico had become a true constitutional court. And the problem that we have now is that we have changed that, and we don't know what is going to happen. And I think that it was a very big mistake. In the next months, we will see a court that will function in a very different way. And I think that is not going to be a good idea and a good message for I will say, for the constitutional state in Mexico. We will speak now about the branches of the government and the relation between them. And I think that the Supreme Court is going to be a very big problem because of the compulsion that we have now in that.
Thank you, Pedro. Your comments lead me to ask you the following question, so we can start tackling the political context and balance of power in Mexico. So from a constitutional perspective, what do these elections results suggest about the future dynamics between the branches of government? And how does the Supreme Court play into this?
Well, for me?
Yes, Pedro.
Oh, sorry. The Constitution was amended, as you know, so that the legislative powers controlled by the ruling party, as well as the government itself, had a strong influence on the selection of candidates of political positions, of judicial positions, sorry. From that point, judicial independence and impartiality were compromised and placed at risk. If we add to this fact that the judiciary itself did not take part in the actual selection of candidates, we find that the vast majority of those who ran in the judiciary election were chosen by the office of the president and its legislative majority. As a result, from that moment on, judicial independence was compromised. Furthermore, if we take into account that the presidency and the government interfered in the electoral process and guided voters to support candidates aligned with the government, then we can conclude that the separation of powers in Mexico is, at least from my point of view, now severely diminished. It's important to note that, in practice, those who will hold the highest positions in the judiciary, beginning with the Supreme Court of Justice, are persons with political and ideological affinities to the administration in power. Then I think that we have problems in that brand.
Right. Thank you, Pedro. Carlota, I want to turn to you and talk about the composition of the new Supreme Court, and if you have any other comments on what Pedro said about the judicial independence of the new 9 justices that will start September 1st, their terms.
The composition of the new court is certainly there is like a connection between. We cannot deny that there is a strong mandate from the current coalition, and that includes influence over the judiciary. However, I do believe that the new composition of the court allows for the interpretation of many new precedents regarding, for example, the elected Chief Justice Hugo Aguilar. He brings a new light into what the economic and social practices in Mexico should be, judicially speaking. We were talking about a transformation of institutions that needed this real profound change, and that is why we are here. to deny the fact that the new composition gives this new opportunity, and in addition, an understanding that the binding precedent system still remains functioning is essential. Because if not, we go down a narrative that, in my opinion, can be alarmist regarding this institutional collapse. So in this regard, I do believe that the new composition of the court, from one stance, there are 3 justices that have a lot of experience because they come from the previous court, and that's just a fact, right? So they understand how the justice system functions. And from the other side, we do have new perspectives as to how justice should be imparted in Mexico.
Thank you, Carlota. Adriana, I would love to hear if you have any thoughts on the new composition of the Supreme Court, and from a rule of law standpoint, what safeguards, if any, remain to protect judicial autonomy inside the Supreme Court?
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone. So from our lab's perspective, and as we wrote in a joint report with the Mexican Bar Association and the Inter-American Dialogue, like, we maintain our position on this reform. We are very critical of not the composition, because here we're not talking about people here. It's about design, right? It's about institutional design. So, and Pedro knows much more about this, but Mexico's constitutional design is about separation of powers, right? And it comes, like, the American Constitution is the same. We have the 3 different branches. Each one has to be independent, and each one will check on the other, right? And the judiciary has to check on the other branches. But for this to happen, judges need to be independent. Without the independence, the check does not really happen, right? So in the current context, Morena is electorally dominant and controls the executive branch and the legislative branch. In such a situation, the system depends a lot on self-restraint by the majority. In Mexico, that self-restraint did not happen. Instead, the majority used its power to change the rules and remove the classic safeguards of judicial independence. Which are these classic safeguards? Which is the thing that we always look for a court to be independent. Non-political selection of judges based on merit and exams. No popularity, no campaigns, no ministro chicharrón. So not political, right? No pressure from the outside. Secure tenure, protected salaries, and an independent disciplinary mechanism to remove judges, and the court's authority to review even constitutional amendments. So by eliminating or weakening these protections, the reform makes judges much more dependent on political actors, right? So judges who must campaign, seek party support, and worry about removal or salary cuts are less likely or even unable to rule against the government when the Constitution requires it. So this new political configuration seriously reduces the judiciary's ability to check the other branches. And again, we may have amazing new judges, right? Amazing new justices. It's not that they are bad people or bad jurists. It's just that they are like this, so it won't happen. They won't be checking on the other branches if they are like this, with a disciplinary tribunal not on top of them, warning them on what to choose when deciding.
Thank you, Adriana. And that would lead me to my next question for Carlota, in terms of if you could explain the new judicial disciplinary tribunal. I know that this is an aspect of the reform that had a lot of people worried about it, if it was going to be acting as a political actor. So if you could delve into that, how it will function in terms of oversight and accountability for the judges.
Certainly. Before I just answer that precisely, I just want to answer to Adriana, which I do understand why there is a lot of maybe panic around this tribunal. However, I do believe that we are anticipating ourselves. We are being a little bit premature as to how it will work. Because the tribunal is now active, and it includes seasoned jurists, former prosecutors, and career judges, people who have worked their way through every rung of the justice system. And I understand why you say that it's not about the people, it's about how the institution will work. I do believe that in this moment of the reform, of the implementation of the reform, people are key. So looking as to who is going to be on those benches, who is going to form these tribunals, is essential to understand how it might work. And because this matters, because oversight without practical understanding tends to be cosmetic. These new members of this judicial discipline tribunal, if they act with integrity, it will change everything because they know where the pressure points are. How, like, for example, judges are captured, how impunity is reproduced, and how misconduct gets hidden. But also we have the other part of the coin, which is the administration or the judicial administration organ. So it's not just the tribunal acting alone on itself, right? So we also have this other organ which serves the administration, but with the new organic law of the judiciary, there is a checks between them as well, a little bit, I do believe. And more importantly, for the first time in modern history, like modern judicial history, we have an independent body with a public mandate to investigate and discipline judges. So this may be, it's seen, as Adriana says, in a maybe negative way. However, and I do think that it's important to keep our eyes on why that couldn't be problematic. However, this is also very positive because this tribunal that now has teeth can change the way in which the institutional rules, and especially regarding external pressure. Because here's the shift. This time, we, society, citizens, lawyers, get pulled to the watchdog accountable too. We elected the members. We know who they are, and that gives civic actors, bar associations, victims, organizations, and the press a much stronger position to demand answers, transparency, and action. The credibility of this tribunal won't be built overnight, but if pressure comes from below, we have a chance to build a real oversight where none existed before. It's not perfect, and I don't think that we should even pretend that it is, but it is a new institutional lever for accountability that simply did not exist under the old model. It's a mechanism that can work, but only if it's used, monitored, and strengthened. And in my opinion, surrendering it before it's even tested can be a political and a civic mistake.
Thank you, Carlota. Pedro, I would love to hear your thoughts on the institutional design of the disciplinary tribunal, and if you see that there are risks to its independence and for it to be used as a political tool.
Yes, I think so. I regret to be pessimistic again, but I think that it was a bad idea, that tribunal, because they are going to control the decisions of the judges in the judiciary sense, and that was a bad idea because the judges has to have the independence to choose their decisions without the fear of being controlled and punished by, in this case, a tribunal. And I think that it was not a good idea because we had a good administration institute inside of the judicial federal. And I think that another bad idea was the reduction of the number of members of the Supreme Court, changing to 9 and not anymore 11. It was a bad idea first because it's going to diminish the quality of the deliberation inside the court. And second, for practical reasons, 2 fewer seats without their support staffs will increase the work for the 9 members of the court. Let us remember that the Mexican Supreme Court already has many unresolved cases, and its new members will have to deal with those cases, plus the ones that arrive over time. Reducing the number of the members reduces the court's capacity to resolve them. But the main problem, I think, that is another one. It's not just the tribunal, and it's not the reduce of the members of the court. I think that the problem is in the elimination of the first and the second chambers of the Supreme Court. I think that is the best problem that we have now, because these 2 chambers made it possible to address cases by specialized subject matters more quickly than the full court could. And now, without the chambers, everything will have to be decided by a smaller full bench. And I think that all these pieces are a bad idea, because we will have a smaller court. We will have no anymore the chambers that will be very important to have them. And we will have this political tribunal inside of the judiciary power that will control the decisions of the judges. I think that all the pieces make a very, very, very big mistake.
So a follow-up question for our audience to see if I got this 100% accurate. So there's not going to be two chambers, and so all the judges will be overseeing all the cases, no matter what the subject matter is in terms of law. So there's no specialization then.
Yes, now everything is going to be resolved by the Supreme Court, but by the 9 members of the Supreme Court. And they will not have the support of the 2 chambers, in which they, before, can resolve the most important cases by specialized matters. And that is going to be a problem, because the 9 members of the court will have to decide everything, and without the support of the 2 chambers, because the 2 chambers, I don't know why, but disappear.
Understood. So Pedro, this leads me to my following question. In terms of rule of law, business climate, and U.S. engagement, with this new institutional design of the Supreme Court, how do you see that it will affect future business-related decisions when it comes to cases that companies end up filing against this before the Supreme Court, if there's no specialization in terms of the cases?
Well, I think that in the past, until now, taking a case to the Supreme Court was the best strategy. That was the promise of the lawyers. I will take your case to the Supreme Court. Now I fear that it will be to avoid it. I think that now you should try to favor mediation and alternative dispute resolutions measures. You have to strengthen your policy teams to operate in Mexico, and you will try to avoid the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court will be a political body. I think so.
Have you seen this shift happening already with companies or legal firms that are starting to shift to international investment dispute arbitration cases?
Yes, I think so. And I think so that some companies are changing the relation between their legal office and political and the political relations ones, because it has sense. It has sense that you have to try to solve your problems in a different way, and you will try to avoid the judiciary, because I insist, we have many problems at the state level, and then it's not a good idea to have a litigation in that level. And the Supreme Court is not going to be anymore a good idea. Then if you try to solve your problems with judges, federal judges, and federal tribunals, or it's better to try to solve it in another way, outside of the judiciary power.
Understood. So yes, our folks from government affairs will have a lot of work to do in Mexico for the upcoming years.
I think so. And they are having now.
Okay, thank you, Pedro. So Carlota, I want to turn to you also to talk about the business climate and how can this impact U.S. engagement. So in terms of the new Supreme Court structure and the new institutional design, how can this affect the business climate in Mexico, particularly regarding contract enforcement, regulatory stability, investment disputes, following up on what Pedro said?
Certainly. Before I get into that, I would just like to say that I do agree that a lot of the issues are now going to be solved through ADR, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. But Pedro's perspective is as if this was negative. And I honestly believe that this is a positive impact, because it means that now local courts and federal courts can focus on more important, like constitutional or criminal matters that actually transcend into society. And also ADR mechanisms are far more flexible, far more cost efficient. This is actually a positive light of this reform, with all the challenges that he has named and that I understand where he's coming from. I do believe that this is a positive impact. So it's important to keep that in mind when we're talking about business, especially, right? So, and now to answer your question, I think that when we talk about the upcoming Supreme Court affecting business climate and rule of law, etc., this is exactly where precision matters. Because amid all of the uncertainty, there is one legal constant. Mexico's binding precedent system remains fully operational. That means that all the key jurisprudence affecting business, on tax matters, on investment protection, on contracts, on processes, on energy regulation, environmental law, all of this that may affect the business climate remains binding and active, regardless of the new composition of the court. So what does this mean for investors and international partners? It means that the legal certainty hasn't vanished. Yes, the faces on the bench have changed, but the precedents remain. Contracts are still protected, regulatory frameworks are still enforceable, and the threshold, and I think this is key, the threshold to override these precedents remains very high. Under constitutional practice, there is a very high argumentative threshold to modify jurisprudence. So instead of assuming legal chaos, let's focus on the instruments of continuity that still provide enforceable, predictable legal guidance. The precedent system is one of them, and it's not just alive, it's functioning. So what matters now is how these justices apply the law, and that's where public scrutiny, institutional vigilance becomes essential. If we assume collapse, we disengage. And if we stay involved, we can help ensure that the court remains a stabilizing force, not a politicized one.
Carlota, do you see that the new institutional design provides the mechanisms for accountability?
I think that the fact that we have chosen the justices, the members of the disciplinary tribunal, the magistrates, gives us elements to hold them accountable in ways that we didn't have before. I do believe that the past system had a lot of challenges, and one of them was the profound opacity. And it was also a very classist system. If you had money, you could access justice. So we do need to reframe the way in which we are seeing this institutional transformation. To whom and for whom was it made? And we do need to think about the majority of Mexicans that suffered profound injustices and that now have the possibility, because what I'm talking about is opportunities. So we are now talking about the possibility of them actually attaining justice. It's an opportunity also for the magistrates and the judges, as Adriana said. A lot of them may be fantastic, right? So they are also, a lot of them come from a career path in justice, like the judicial career, sorry. And in this regard, they are prepared, so we can hold them accountable. And that is something that we must use. It is a democratic new tool that we have, and that we must use it.
I really like the way you framed it as opportunities. So Adriana, I would love to hear your thoughts on that, if what you consider the new opportunities with this new institutional design, and then also if you have any other comments on the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, how will that play into the new cases brought up in Mexico, and then also your thoughts on legal certainty with this new judicial election.
Sure. So first, do we have accountability mechanisms? The answer is definitely yes, but which type of accountability do we have now? We have political accountability, right? So this is what we see. We have unprotected judges, against political parties. In this case, the majority political party is Morena. So the accountability comes from the political party. Right? So judges, everything is about incentives. So judges will be thinking, oh, what can I do to stay in power? Right? So I have to comply with whatever my voting population wants to, which is Morena, right? So I won't rule against Morena because then I won't be reelected. So that's the type of accountability that we warrant with our report, that we say It is not for judges, because that's accountability for legislators, because you want legislators to be biased. You want legislators to be biased towards your preferences, but you don't want judges to be biased towards a political party. You don't want judges to be biased towards the person that is going to be voting for them. And we provided several examples, several in the US at the state level, showing that whenever you have voting for judges, judges tend to rule in favor of the parties that provided some support for them in their campaign. So we do have accountability, but not the accountability we need for the judiciary, right? We have political accountability, which is exactly what we don't want at the judiciary. And it's about protecting judges, right? So, and Carlota was telling us that the disciplinary tribunals conformation is amazing, and there are amazing people there, and I have no doubt, right? Like, I won't dispute that. But these judges, even if they're amazing, they are not protected, right? They are subject to the political will. And they have to comply with the orders coming from wherever they come. When in this case, it's about politicization of the justice, right? So it's about protecting those judges. And you were asking about opportunities. Like, we don't see any opportunity, no, in terms of judicial independence with this judicial framework, right? From the lab's perspective, when you have this institutional design explicitly established in the Constitution, there's no way you can protect enough your judges for them to rule unbiased and to provide good decisions. Regarding the arbitration, I remember I was invited to several these big law firms where, what's the judicial reform, and can you tell us what's going to happen? And they were not concerned at all, right? Because they were like, oh, we'll use much more arbitration. And as Carlota said, like, arbitration is a great mechanism to solve disputes for rich people, right? For rich companies. Arbitration can't be used in many other disputes, and cannot be used by companies that startups won't be using arbitration, right? So you are affecting the weaker parties in the system. And I also wanted to say something, because Carlota is asking us not to be fatalist or alarmist. And we're not, right? Like, companies invest in China, and we know China doesn't have an independent judiciary. It's just about changing incentives and increasing safeguards, right? Companies are going to invest in Mexico, but now they'll know that the judiciary is politicized, and they'll use other mechanisms. They'll use much more, and I don't want to say arbitration, but also negotiations, right? Corruption is also going to increase. Lobbying is going to be increasing, so they'll invest their money not on the judiciary, not on lawyers, but maybe through other negotiations. And I think those are my answers for these questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Adriana. Pedro, I know that you want to say something, and also I actually wanted to ask you something else, so if you can answer that too. If you could also comment on the president system in Mexico, how this new institutional design will impact that.
It's important. It's in the same way, because I have to say that I believe that the argument of the democratic legitimacy, does not hold. If we take into account that the only 13% of citizens went to vote, that is, there was 87% abstentions, and that afterward a significant number of those votes were annulled, then we see that in reality, the democratic legitimacy that was promised was not fulfilled. Beyond the fact that I believe this is not the kind of legitimacy that should apply to judges. The legitimacy of judges depends on their reasoning, their independence, their consistency, their rulings, not on their democratic popularity. And that it's an important point. And now I fear that we will face a situation in which all the decisions that were decided in the past, most of them important and good decisions, the precedents, maybe will be not taken in account by the new judges. I think that the Supreme Court will try to invent a new way to take decisions, and that's not a good idea for a judiciary story. The precedents are so important because we, the people, we need to know what is going to happen and which could be the sense of the decision of the next court. And I think that now we are not knowing anything about that, and that uncertainty is a bad idea for us.
So would you say that the president system will be highly politicized?
I think so. I think so. Let's see. As Carlota said, let's see. Maybe it's going to be a good way to roll. I don't think so, because the Supreme Court. I will say something about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court now in Mexico has a very technical level, and I think that the new court will not have that level. It's going to be a political court with another way to take decisions, and the legal arguments are not going to be the most important trends to the decision that they will hold.
Thank you, Pedro. That's a very good point. Going back to Carlota, we have a question for you. So how long do you think that, if ever, before if the public will identify tangible long-term results of this new institutional design?
Honestly, couldn't say. I think that what we're going through is a profound institutional transformation that will require a lot of time for adaptation. I also believe that there are a lot of the whole institutions that are a part of this transformation. They don't want the collapse of the system. We want to uphold them. And I think that that's one of the things that we should bear in mind. And just to answer really quickly to what Pedro was saying regarding the precedent system, changing a precedent is not like flipping a switch. It's a legally demanding process with a reinforced duty to justify the change. The high threshold is one of the strongest safeguards that we have for legal certainty, even in times of institutional transition. And this is established in the organic law of the judiciary. It's established even in precedents of the Supreme Court. It cannot go back on precedents as easy as they would maybe want to, or even if they don't want to. That's not how it works, which is why I do believe that the binding precedent system is very important for absolutely every citizen, but when we're talking about the business climate, especially for them, because it does give us legal certainty as to how judges, magistrates are going to be ruling. And that is right now a safeguard. And I do believe that it is important to bear that in mind. And just to address this judicial independence matter, I completely understand why there are so many preoccupations around the independence. But what we're seeing is not the end of judicial independence, but rather a shift in how the independence is constructed, perceived, and contested. To jump to conclusions about absolute judicial subordination is, at this point, I do believe it is a little bit alarmist. And I also think that it polarizes it undermines the efforts to build real oversight. So bearing in mind that there is this preoccupation, there is this challenge that we need to address, that is this focus that we need to keep our pressuring on, that's positive. It's also always good to be critical about what we're going through in our society, but not from a point of view that there's nothing else we can do, right? That it's done, that we're that there is absolute judicial subordination. I think that we can pressure and we can keep oversight and vigilance, and that is where we should keep our focus on.
Well, we all hope that is the case, that the mechanisms incorporated, the few mechanisms incorporated for vigilance and transparency are not politicized and used by the people that hold power to curb judicial independence. So we could talk about these issues for a other couple of minutes, but I would like to now turn to the bilateral cooperation aspect of this new judicial elections and institutional design. So, Carlota, I'll start with you. How might this new composition affect U.S. Mexico cooperation on issues such as anti-corruption, organized crime, prosecutions, extraditions, etc.? I know that that's a lot wrapped into a single question, but if you could give us a brief answer, I would appreciate it.
I'll give a very brief answer. There's no denying that the credibility of Mexico's judiciary is central to bilateral cooperation. But we should also be honest, Mexico's judiciary already faced major challenges in tackling organized crime and impunity. There were federal and local courts that were compromised by criminal interests long before this reform. What's different now is that these risks and issues are exposed to public scrutiny. The judges, magistrates, and disciplinary authorities are no longer anonymous technocrats. They're public figures with a mandate from voters. That opens up a new channel for civic oversight, because the visibility opens up new possibilities for pressuring the system from the outside. If we as citizens and as institutions keep the pressure on, the system can become more accountable than it's ever been. And that's the opportunity. It's not a guarantee, but a terrain where institutional cooperation can be rebuilt on a stronger, more transparent ground. And the U.S., as Mexico's closest institutional partner, can play a critical role here, not by intervening in domestic politics, but by supporting transparency infrastructure, promoting judicial training, funding anti-corruption tools, etc. This is a moment not to disengage, but to deepen cooperation around the rule of law, not just security, because fighting organized crime doesn't just require arrest, it requires credible, legitimate, independent courts that can hold those arrests up in court. And that is where we can pressure so that this can actually happen in these ways.
So you see a scenario where citizens would pressure the Mexican judicial system to tackle anti-corruption, organized crime prosecutions, and then that would have a beneficial impact.
Sorry.
And that would have a direct beneficial impact with the United States security cooperation.
I think it's essential that civil society organizations and citizens understand what the impact of the organized crime prosecutions can have even on them. And in this regard, we can pressure. There are mechanisms in place that we can use, especially now with this new model with the administration, like judicial administration organ, and with this disciplinary tribunal. So,
Elena, what do you think about what Carlota just said in terms of holding accountable and bringing to justice the people that need to be brought to justice with this new institutional design? And then how could that overlap with U.S. Mexico security cooperation? Does this new system have the mechanisms and the independence to do that? And then if you think so, how would the citizen component would play into that?
So again, we don't see the institutional design, to perform these functions, right? We don't see it happening. We have been analyzing many other judiciaries in the world, and it doesn't happen, right? Hungary, Turkey, El Salvador, it's always that way. And again, there are gonna be companies investing in Mexico. For sure, they'll just switch their methods, right? But I wanted to say, because it's funny that we are talking about precedent, because when you are in the U.S., the U.S. is a common law tradition system in which precedent is the whole thing, right? Certainty is built through precedent. But Mexico is a civil law tradition country, right? In which precedent has become very important, but still the law is the law. And we have seen that the law can be changed. I mean, constitutional amendments happened in a few days, right? So we can always change the law. We don't require the Supreme Court to do it. So precedent is not a safeguard in a civil law tradition country, right? It may be good. It gives us some certainty about a certain degree of interpretations, right? But you are bounded by the law. That's how the civil law tradition countries work. And it's not that the lab or us, or we are not fatalist. We can still do things. Of course, we want to do things. We can change the system again, and we can change the Constitution. Again, it was not that difficult to change the Constitution, right? So Of course, we can acknowledge that we need much more protection for our judges to perform these amazing functions and powers, no, that Carlota is mentioning. Maybe we should think again, we should sit, dialogue, no, and discuss how to protect these judges enough for them to be able to perform where a judge has to be performing in a separation of powers and rule of law country, right? And how to provide these checks and balances over the executive branch and the legislative.
And in terms of criminal cases, there have been a lot of worries that some judges that were elected in June 1st had ties with criminal organizations, corruption, etc. So do you see that there would be a consequence in terms of U.S. Mexico security cooperation with these new judges being elected?
I think that that's a tricky question, because I don't think it's going to be about judicial independence, but it's going to be about negotiations between both the countries, right? So what we will see is that the judge will be doing whatever the president wants them to do, right? The executive branch. If there's this negotiation to send criminals, cartels, leaders to the U.S., they will be enforcing those decisions. What we won't see is a president using the morning conferences to say, oh, this judge with name, no, it made this horrible decision, and there's no criminal oversight over cartels. We won't see that. We won't see our executive branch criticizing the judges, because they won't want to do anything to be criticized. So they'll be enforcing whatever the policy coming from the executive branch is.
Or maybe from whoever helped them get elected. Right? I mean, if they were campaigning to get elected, I'm sure that they have other interests, perhaps, from not only the executive branch, but from other groups.
Oh, definitely. And I hear, and this was very interesting, because we have to acknowledge that this happened before, right? Especially at the state level, we did have some judges that were like appointed, like, or elected by the cartels. Right? And this happened. The only difference is that now it's legal, right? Before it was not legal, now it is legal. So there won't be that much change in terms of how much organized crime influences for example, at the state level. But at the federal level, that's going to be a big switch, right? So we have to acknowledge that this happened before. It's going to definitely still be happening. I remember there was a DEA report when the proposal was announced, and they already had the lists of several cartels, like doing these lists in which they wanted these lawyers to be proposed as judges. Of course, who wouldn't, right? Like it's natural. It's the incentives the judicial reform provides is exactly that. You want to put there your judges because you want to rule them in favor of you. So my answer is, like, I'm not sure about who's gonna have more influence, if organized crime or like the federal or Morena through what any policy Morena wants to impose, right?
Could you briefly explain what you meant by now it's legal, so our audience can fully understand the legal part of being elected by organized crime? Like, if you can explain that.
Yeah, because I don't know if you remember that there were several names. I think Senator Noroña even said, oh, there were some names that appeared there. I think we overlooked, but it was legal, right? It is legal to have those names because there was no scrutiny, right? So it's legal for organized crime to support a candidate because it's legal for me, it's illegal for every person. So it comes from popularity, even if the popularity comes from organized crime, right? They can put their people there. So that's why I said now it's legal. Now you can see that organized crime or the army can be saying, oh, this is our candidate. We will support this specific candidate, or we'll go and vote for this specific candidate. And before that didn't happen because that was not the way to appoint judges.
Thank you, Adriana. Yeah, just wanted to make that clarification in terms of what you meant by it being legal. So unfortunately, we are running out of time. Thank you very much, all of our audience, our amazing 3 panelists for today's discussion. We will be at the Mexico program at the Dialogue discussing these issues in the following months. And for everybody that didn't get to watch, we'll be uploading the recording soon to our website. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Carlota.